local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are most pleased to welcome you back to part 2 of a 2-week series about a very, very important subject from our neighbors at Gonzaga University. At that institution, they have organized the Gonzaga Institute for Action Against Hate. And on last week's program, for any of you who was not watching, we talked about the structure and how it came about, and it's been adopted by the trustees at Gonzaga University. And we're very pleased to have back the 3 guests from last week to now move into the subject itself about what hate is. I welcome to the program, first of all, George Critchlow, who is the director of the University Legal Assistance, and he is also a member of the law school faculty. And next to him is Karen Harwood. She is the chair of the Gonzaga Institute for Action Against Hate and also an administrator with the law school. And next to her is Robert Bartlett, who is the director of cultural affairs at Gonzaga University. And all 3 of our guests are also members of the board for the Institute and have lots to do with putting this together. Welcome back, and we're very pleased that you could come back. I very much enjoyed last week's program, and I want to congratulate you again for what you're doing. This will have, I think, very important ramifications in the future. And I'm going to get right directly to the substantive issue that the Institute's all about. And I know that you have a lot of research to do, and that a few years from now you might add to this definition, but let us start with it today anyway, and that is, what is hate, and where does it come from? And before you answer that question, I'd just like to preface it by saying that it seems to me that hate has had an awful lot to do with the problems around the world and wars and violence. But with that, who would like to take on first the question of what hate is?
I'll take a crack at the beginning, and then the 2 of you can join in, because we've had quite an interesting discussion about this. And one of the exciting things about working on this project is it allows you to, all of us, to delve into these questions as well as working in a sort of a practical manner. One of the things that we are looking forward to doing as part of this institute is really being able to explore all those issues and find out. I think a lot of us have ideas about where hate comes from, what are the components. We certainly believe that there's a great deal of it that is learned. I certainly believe that a lot of it has to do with fear and lack of understanding and lack of comfort with differences and being afraid to find out, that what a difference is, why it's not threatening. So we have, and I think we have a lot of work to do to figure out what goes below that. One of the things, George, we were just talking about is the question we don't know the answer to. Is there a biological component to hate? We don't know that. It would be wonderful to have a psychologist, neurobiologist, someone like that come to campus and work as a visiting professor. Look into those questions.
George, would you like to take that?
Well, I was going to say, it really is a very complex and deep question, and rather than answering it, I'll duck it by saying I think the value of having this institute is the same as having an institute that studies a theory of, say, economics. One needs to develop a theory of economics and an analysis of economics, and it's a never-ending process of understanding how, say, economic systems work. I think we've got an ongoing challenge here to understand, and it may be a never-ending process of what hate is and what the potential solutions and strategies are for dealing with hate. My own view is very similar to Karen's, that it's a lack of understanding, a lack of ability to tolerate differences, and somehow in our cultures we develop a defensive posture in terms of difference, which then manifests itself in terms of kind of hate. And I think manifestations that are most destructive and perhaps most typical of what I'm talking about is violence, and it's violence in interpersonal situations involving intimate partners and friends, as well as violence, say, on a larger scale between nations. But we have this way of dealing with a lack of tolerating the other person or the other thing through very destructive forms of behavior. that all has something to do with hate, in my view. And I would like to personally, and I think the country, the culture needs to learn more about what is at work here, what are those dynamics, and how can we sort of deconstruct that and find out what the ingredients are in order to build a better solution and ultimately a better society.
You've triggered another thinking process for me, and that is that we often see that people are in love, and also love can turn to hate. One of the most difficult types of court cases are oftentimes divorce and child custody and so forth. Will it be necessary as you try to delve into hate to show any kind of relationship with love? If we understand love better, do we then better understand the opposite to it? That just came to mind as you were talking, George.
No, I think so. In fact, we've already talked about this. We said in the earlier program that this, the idea here and where we're moving is very consistent with the Gonzaga Jesuit mission, which of course is to some extent a religious study and faith-based mission. Some people, particularly from the religious sector, have been suggesting that there is this very interesting and intimate connection between love and hate, and we may have to start looking at that. At least one of the perspectives which will allow us to understand and look at that better would be looking at the question of love. What do we mean by love, and what is the flip side of that?
Bob?
I'm going to avoid the love-hate discussion for the moment, but I would like to go back to something that George said earlier, because I have some thoughts on how this hate begins and manifests. And I think of it in terms, I agree totally with what he said, but I'd like to add another thing, and that's resource scarcity. I had an experience of being able to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at one time as a sociologist, and I worked in endangered species. I'm here to tell you that there are a lot of folks out there who do not care for wolves, spotted owls, California sea otters, black-footed ferrets, and bald eagles, for that matter, because of something that I'd like to call conditions of resource scarcity. If you tell folks that they have to give up their way of life, their livelihood, or an entire community for that matter, say it's in timber, because of a particular species, right? They're going to choose that species and then the federal government, possibly, to focus on as the enemy, and that could lead to hate. That's just one example in the natural resource world, and we are here in a natural resource area, right? When folks begin to see that there are serious conditions of resource scarcity out there, I think that sets up a dynamic that can easily lead to hate. You are telling me that I cannot do what I have done, or my family, or my community has done for 3-4 generations, and it has to do with a bird. And not seeing the full scope of the issue, that it's not just the bird. The bird is just an indicator of some other dynamic that's going on. And so I began to think in terms, when I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in terms of resource scarcity. We could take that into political discussion, conditions of resource scarcity around that, folks feeling that they do not have access to speak, people who have limited access or no access anymore to natural resources because of one thing or another, or economics, money for that matter. Money is scarce.
One of the reasons that it's so fun to interview all of you on a very serious topic is you stimulate one's thinking, and it moves rather rapidly. Bob, in relation to what you just said, again, and you've been involved with this more than I in putting all this together, but maybe there are different roots for hate, and one of them is economic, a very strong one, that someone may start out not hating, but if their livelihood's threatened, or their economic security, not only in the example you gave, but across the globe, that can turn to hate. But is that one of the possible roots of hate, and there are others for other reasons?
I would like to say I had the absolute answer on this. I don't. But just working around an idea that it seems to be, at least in my experience and people that I talk to, somewhat consistent. Take another example. Take the person that loses a job in an industry. At the same time that person sees someone hired, it could be a person of color, it could be a person with disability, and this person is no longer able to do their job for whatever reason. They may have been let go just because they were a poor performer, but how easily it sets up the potential for that person to focus their loss of employment on the fact that the company is having to do what they consider to be this other thing, that is to hire people of color, to hire women. I'm saying, for the men in the, in the audience, and so that gives them something to focus their energies on. You see, and so I see that as just one of those one of those areas that sparks something that could create a flame in a person till they begin to take their loss out personally.
It seems to me that I agree that there's probably an untold number of reasons, because hate is not, I don't think, the primary emotion that we're dealing with. Hate is probably a conclusion or a way of dealing with a situation. We have so many things. The topics, the two issues you mentioned, Bob, are so complex. There are so many components in economics and social structure and variety of things that it's so hard to understand that if you're the person who sees themselves as a victim, that it is much easier to just make that quick conclusion and say it's because of the spotted owl, or it is because of affirmative action, or something like that, and reach a conclusion, and from there build a whole structure, a whole worldview around that leads you then to categorize people and to not look at those deeper
I thought
issues.
on those terms. So the mechanism of hate may be there to deal with something that's a deeper problem. Mm-hmm. That hate is an avenue that can be used to try to deal with one's deeper frustrations.
But is it possible that hate is simply a lack of alternative tools? That hate, as you were suggesting, is a manifestation that arises because people have never been equipped educationally, culturally, or through their parenting with more positive and more productive tools for dealing with frustration, for dealing with difference, and for making sense of a very complex world. Because there's no question but all of us at all times deal with conflict. But not all of us deal with it in a hateful way. Some of us have tools that we got in some fashion or another, and maybe some of them are genetic in their basis. I don't know, but I'm not convinced necessarily that hate has some independent reality or meaning or existence apart from looking at what it is a substitute for.
When you look at some major historical figures that certainly were persecuted and for their work and their beliefs, and I think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Muhammad Gandhi as examples, you would think that if anyone could give a reason for hate, they could. In the case of both men, they were, of course, assassinated for their work, and they'd had suffered a lot before that, and yet they had found a way, George, what you're talking about, to not hate. I know Dr. King in particular, and Bob, I'll come back to you with this, he indicated that if one hates, that one destroys themselves, that he was really advocating that one not do that. Playing on what George said, is there something we can reach a hold of here to cope with hate as you open up the work of the Institute?
I would hope that through the Institute and its various arms and efforts, we might be able to come up with, going back to using the tool metaphor, to provide people with access to tools so that they do not resort to hate. I think that's an interesting thought, George. For example, the displaced person in timber or in a natural resource area, to provide a way for that person to get whatever education they need to transition into another line of work. I think what sets this up is when that person feels like this is all they know, this is all they do, and they're good at it. And we've just said you cannot be good at it anymore because that has reached the end. So the Institute could possibly, I would hope, begin to address how we can provide and maybe be the ones to provide people with access to the information and the tools they need to make the transition so they do not result where their actions do not result in hate. I think if we were to be able to pull that off in the slightest way, we would get a lot of attention. And when you mention Gandhi and King, you're mentioning two extraordinary human beings. I don't see us on par with them at all, but they had a lot of other things going for them in their work and in using love and so on in their behavior. But I think that going back to the practical side of it, if we can begin to address the issues of what do people need to transition successfully, get back on their feet, be productive and not feel like they've been left behind by technology or left behind by the political process, we will have done great things.
So if one looks at this in steps and processes, that one thing is trying to understand what it is or what creates a certain situation, and then secondly, trying to deal with some solutions to lessen the hate or to eradicate the hate. But I want to go to another area on this very same issue. I think we can also think of examples where it's not economic or where one's not lost jobs. In fact, one is doing very well in their life, both economically and education and so forth, but yet we find individuals that have very deep hate for other reasons. So are we addressing at that point another form of hate or another possible solution? Sometimes George, earlier you talked about intimacy and so forth, where people often are hurt, but there's no economic threat to them. Do we have to categorize these in separate?
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we do have to. Maybe, as this study of hate becomes more of a science rather than the art that it is when we're just speculating, we'll learn something about the different categories and different layers. I think possibly there are deeper reasons that cause people to hate. Some of it may be power related. You find that to the extent that you can sort of tap people's hatred, even though you may not be much of a hater yourself, then you get more of a power base, and that works in politics, and it works in local business, and it works in so many ways in our society.
Being a demagogue in the political process
exactly.
to control.
Yeah, so you use it basically as a political lever or a tool to get what you want, and maybe that's worth studying as well. I do think that the Institute can provide a lot in the way of research in getting at those definitions, those understandings, and possible solutions. But there's something we haven't talked about yet, too. One of the prongs that you had mentioned earlier is advocacy. We're talking about research, education, and advocacy. It may be in some areas that it's less important to figure out why a certain person or group hates, even though that's not to say it's not important, but it's also important to find out through advocacy how to defend society against that hate, whether you defend through legal action or other proactive community outreach.
Or a combination.
Or a combination. And I think one of the things we'll be doing is saying that because we're probably not going to be successful, at least too quickly, eradicating hate from our communities, what can we do in terms of proactive advocacy to make sure that the haters among us have only minimal impact, if any. And I think that then engages the law school through the legal clinic, through legal training to sensitize new lawyers as to how to deal with hate in a positive way in society. And it also means that other departments, we talked earlier about the multidisciplinary aspect of the Institute, how other departments can find ways of teaching students to directly engage in issues of hate to make a difference.
Karen, I'll come back to you. And again, as you're really dealing with an overwhelming question, and I wish you well, but maybe some case studies. Have you given thought to this? If one brings into seminars or situations people who have been exercising hate in a very clear way, or people who have been victims and targets of the hate, can we from that, some of us have been more fortunate than others and have escaped as much of the hate as some have. What role does that play in addressing this question?
I think it's a very interesting question, because I think for a lot of us, we finally understand the depth of this problem when we talk to someone who's been a victim. And this idea grew out of a situation where some people were victims of someone who hated and sent them awful letters because of that hatred. So I think that there is always that piece. It's so easy to get very theoretical in the way we approach topics like this. And of course, an academic institution, that's the tools of our trade. But I think that one of the benefits that we can bring to the community is to help both through the advocacy that George would be doing in the law clinic, dealing with individuals who have been victims of these situations, or also just through the work that we do with community groups or in our classes working with students, is to put a human face on this. You know, another thing I think is very interesting about, or an advantage to having this housed at Gonzaga, is that there is a definite spiritual component to this whole issue. And the Jesuit tradition and the mission of the university lends us to exploring those kinds of issues. I thought of that when you mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King and Gandhi, that probably the core that allowed them to transcend the awful things that they had to see and deal with, and ultimately the fact of being assassinated, goes to that spiritual core. And so I think that's a piece that we as a private Catholic Jesuit institution can also bring into this study that I think will add a dimension that's going to be valuable for everyone we touch with our work.
I think you really tapped something of very great significance. Mm-hmm. I often think of in talking to people or touring and involved in some work of human rights, we discuss something called the human spirit. Mm-hmm. And that's in different contexts for different persons, depending on their religious and philosophical background. But let's pursue that for a moment in more detail. If a human spirit has been damaged, or possibly it's been injured, damaged, or maybe even almost stamped out. I think of the human spirit as like a candle alight, and it's been snuffed out. Then what is the result? Is it hate then? Or if you're saying if you have a well-protected human spirit, can you buffer against hate, even though you may find yourself a victim?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I certainly think that where there has been damage to the spirit, I think there's certainly the person is more vulnerable to being susceptible to these kinds of things. George mentioned hate as being fear of comes from economic threat and so on, but it is also, I think, can come from the threat to the spirit, or the protection of what's left of that little core that's left of your self that has been damaged in some way or another. That it's often a defense. It allows you not to have to deal with that pain.
Or simply because there's an empty receptacle there, mm-hmm. and it's easy to fill that with hate when there's no spirit left, you know.
Mm-hmm. Bob,
this raised an interesting thought in my head, and that is the thought that for many organizations, for the many that are around our country right now, who are involved in hate of various kinds, to my recollection, many of them have or exercise some belief, Christian belief, and where they use the Bible, the same Bible that other people use for good, seem to and it's interesting to think about this at this moment. Maybe that's how they're fueling or trying to keep that flame, that spiritual flame, alive. So they use a Christian message to try to address that spirit. And so when I think of groups around the country that are traditional haters, historical haters, the Klan and others, use Christian beliefs to fuel their, or at least it seems anyway, to fuel their belief that other people are subhuman, or other people are from the devil, or offspring of this, that, and the other.
And they come from a totally different interpretation than what the mainstream Christianity does, because Christianity is based on love, as many other religions are. But it's a twist that's so totally different. How about the whole issue of children. Bob, I'll come back to you. I know you're very interested in children and their development. And what can we learn from children? Are the most honest people on the planet. You know, when they're very young,
Sure.
they tell you what they think, and they've not learned to hide certain feelings and beliefs. Can we, in your institute, use children to help us understand how hate may come out of certain situations if we don't do certain things? Because I think children are, at a very young age, are filled with lots of love and honesty.
Children are wonderful teachers. And I hope my children aren't watching right now, or else they'll ask me to sit down and learn more from them. But indeed, that seems to be the case. Having children, 4 of my own, and watched and participated in their growing up, they are very observant, and they're very good teachers. My own children will point out something of another child that they play with, talking about maybe that person has big ears, Dad. You know Billy, the one with the big ears, or freckles, or this, that, and the other thing. They will talk about those things, but they rarely talk about color, rarely ever. If they're trying to describe a friend or someone that I'm supposed to take somewhere with them, and I'm having trouble, they will use all kinds of descriptors, and if there is a color thing, they might.
We're almost out of time, so they are, from what you're saying, they're like a sponge. They're learning so much, and they're observing, and what we say back to them may affect that whole process.
Exactly.
In the time we have left, there's one other question I do want to get in, and I'll probably come back to George for this one. There's not many emotions or issues that have affected the human race any more than love and hate, and my question is, in the time left, is why has it been so long for some group as yours to deal with this subject on this level? It's just amazing it hasn't been done before.
I don't know. I think probably because it's such a complex issue, it's easier to just take a piece of it through a separate, discrete discipline and focus on it in that way. And to bring it all together is just another layer on the academic scene that's difficult to put together. We're going to try to do it.
On behalf of our staff, I thank all 3 of you, and again, I wish you very well in your endeavors and congratulate you for setting up the Gonzaga Institute for Action Against Hate. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had 2 weeks. What I have felt has been a very important subject, and we're excited about what may happen at Gonzaga University in this area. And I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we shall move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.